assure you that what you will observe is a vast wasteland.
To try and channel it for
You will
good.
see a procession of games
Deny
and
what they think is
formulas.
false argument.
Let me assert my
You have
firm
to
belief that the only
free
thing we have to
and uncorrupted communication.
Thank you, Tom, for the introduction. I'd also like to thank David Krieger and the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation for inviting me to be part of this very important conference and among such noted and valuable colleagues. We often lament that it's one thing to underscore the need for disarmament. It's quite another thing to figure out how concretely we can move tangibly in that direction. In my paper, I've tried to explore one possible answer to that question, which I will talk about today. As a preliminary point, I wanted to note that although our panel is entitled Initiatives Focused on the U.S., my particular subject matter is applicable to all countries. What I'd like to do is review two main points that I've discussed in my paper. First, how the changed conditions and key challenges of the post-Cold War world underscore the continuing relevance and meaning of the goal of nuclear disarmament, but in the context of what I term the second nuclear era. And secondly, to then review the utility of renewing progress toward nuclear disarmament by compelling all governments with both extant and latent nuclear capabilities to generate and publish roadmaps of how they would achieve national nuclear disarmament, which would then be the basis for a transnational debate aimed at constituting a single global roadmap to disarmament. The quest for disarmament is a paramount necessity in the 21st century, just as it was a defining imperative of the latter half of the 20th. However, in my view, the nature of that challenge has changed in important ways with the end of the Cold War. In the first nuclear era, a major focus was rightly on the two superpowers. The end of the Cold War relieved some of the principal dangers associated with the nuclear arms competition of the superpowers, and so brought with it encouraging progress toward the end of nuclear disarmament. In my paper, I discussed some of those important steps that took place as the Cold War came to an end. But over the course of the 1990s, progress toward nuclear disarmament languished. Setbacks on old issues were accompanied by the emergence of a number of new dangers. Why was this the case? Progress toward nuclear disarmament in the past decade and a half has stalled in part because of political fecklessness, militaristic cultures, and the power of commercial arms interests. But these factors have long been present and cannot fully account for recent trends. Nor does the tenacious appeal of nuclear weapons derive from some abstract strategic logic. These ambitions have roots, particularly in this second nuclear era, in specific circumstances in which the capacity to make nuclear threats provides political benefits. Nuclear disarmament efforts have stalled in part because we haven't caught up with how the post-Cold War international terrain has introduced a new nuclear era with reshaped nuclear dangers. Dangers to which governments, by their nature, are now, I think, less responsive than they were previously. Hence, the challenge of nuclear disarmament today is about more than eliminating nuclear weapons themselves. Nuclear threat-making capacity is now as relevant as the material capacities. U.S. nuclear deterrence and counterproliferation postures, the shift to a capabilities rather than a threat-based formulation for making strategy, and adaptive planning for nuclear use are all more pernicious than the mere numerical size of the U.S. stockpile. But as has been pointed out by Richard Falk and others, the U.S. is not alone as a country pursuing dangerous policies. China's and India's resistances to joining multilateral arms control processes until the U.S. and Russian arsenals are reduced to sizes comparable to their own have now become anachronistic. And even states without nuclear weapons can leverage their latent capabilities to make potent threats. As the recent UN Security Council report has documented, some 40 countries now possess the industrial and scientific infrastructure to build nuclear weapons relatively quickly. States whose potential nuclear weapons capabilities can influence regional and global international relations, including states as disparate as Japan and Iran, are as responsible for promoting nuclear disarmament as is the United States. The utter stalemate of the 2005 NPT Review Conference in May of last year demonstrates the unrelenting strain that these new pressures have placed on the core bargain at the heart of the NPT treaty. And I don't have to reiterate what that entails. Many of the papers for this conference have gone into tremendous detail about various aspects of the NPT. The only point that I'd like to raise with respect to the NPT is that it faces a challenge today, not so much in my view because it has failed, but because the nuclear dangers of this second nuclear era have changed. The increased value of nuclear threat-making, fueling perceptions of nuclear capabilities as a currency of power, has eroded the common obligation to pursue nuclear disarmament that all states share. This ambivalence is a fundamental source of the paralysis of the NPT, which demonstrates the need for a new initiative, separate from the NPT, but building upon it, to rekindle substantive movement toward global nuclear disarmament. A new strategy for disarmament focused on eliminating nuclear weapons coercion in all of its forms would engage all states equally on a non-discriminatory basis. This approach would sidestep the conflicts between the nuclear haves and the nuclear have-nots endemic to the NPT. This approach would also engage as equals the 4 non-NPT members. The concept of roadmaps to disarmament is one possible means toward such an end. This notion would be promoted through a citizen-based initiative to rekindle nuclear disarmament by compelling all governments with extant or latent nuclear capabilities to generate and publish roadmaps delineating very precisely how they would move to disarmament. These roadmaps would then become the basis for a transnational debate aimed at constituting a single public global roadmap. Such roadmaps would overcome 4 principal obstacles to current disarmament efforts. Roadmaps would dispel the impression, so prevalent today, that nuclear disarmament is utopian, too distant and too indefinable ever to be reached. Roadmaps would be a constant reminder of the end to which all arms control and nonproliferation efforts should be aimed. Each country's individual roadmap would be a visible, permanent metric of that state's progress toward the goals that have been laid out. And the global roadmap generated from the accumulation of the national efforts would link all states in a sequential ordering, clearly identifying which states are next to take the defined steps, preventing paralysis and creating accountability. Why should this effort be citizen-based? Many governments today, both with and without nuclear weapons, are seduced by a misplaced faith in the power and prestige that nuclear capabilities are said to offer. Hence, nuclear disarmament cannot be achieved solely through mechanisms between governments, such as the NPT. Nuclear disarmament is now also very much about superseding the prerogatives of government. This suggests the need to conceptualize the challenge of disarmament as a global public policy issue related to human security. And it suggests that a new disarmament initiative cannot be expected from governments. It must come from the people. A new strategy to press governments to respond to the new conditions of this new nuclear era must begin by reviving the global public's sense of urgency. The United States bears a particular responsibility for leadership, and yet its government is among the most recalcitrant. Therefore, it is in the United States that popular power most requires mobilizing. Developing a national roadmap would admittedly not oblige any state to dismantle a single nuclear weapon. But in my view, this is an advantage, because governments could not or would find it much more difficult to resist undertaking this small disarmament measure on grounds that would impinge their national security, as happens so often with efforts to obtain other measures dealing with capabilities directly. At the same time, disarmament roadmaps would act powerfully to reverse popular perceptions that nuclear disarmament, if desirable, is implausible and utopian. Roadmaps embodying a finite set of criteria and steps to achieve disarmament would, by their very nature, clear away the fog, obscuring the path from today to a nuclear-free world. Each state producing a roadmap would specify its material and political prerequisites for disarmament and detail specific plans for verifiably eliminating all elements of their nuclear capabilities. This would include the irreversible dismantling of existing nuclear arms and the verifiable restriction of all nuclear weapons development capacities, particularly fissile material capacities, in peaceful nuclear facilities. Publication of these reports would create a matrix of conditions for global disarmament. The cumulative list would no doubt be daunting. But the existence of these national roadmaps would initiate a global dialogue and debate toward combining them into a single roadmap to disarmament. After a suitable period of dialogue, an international conference could be convened to knit together these roadmaps into a single global plan capable of receiving universal support. The resulting global roadmap would be complex. Its timeline for achievement would likely be extended. Implementation of this roadmap would be fraught with challenges, as international conditions would continue to evolve in unpredictable ways. But with a roadmap in hand specifying reciprocal steps by all states, progress could be carefully metered and monitored, and accountability for setbacks fairly allocated. Now, in my paper, I discuss a little bit more about what a civil society strategy would look like, some of the questions and challenges pertaining to this. The thinking of this paper owes a great deal to conversations I've had with David Courtwright, who's going to be talking about this concept in his panel after our panel concludes. So I'm going to skip over that part of my paper, which David will be going into in a little bit more detail, and just make a few concluding remarks. Nuclear disarmament has always been not only an ultimate goal, but also a vision with practical consequences for nearer-term arms control and nonproliferation. The vision reminds us that arms control and nonproliferation are means to a greater end, not simply instruments to curb the greatest dangers of a nuclear status quo. But here we face a cruel paradox, because the success in mitigating the most severe dangers of the Cold War era has made it easier for governments to disassociate the nearer-term means from the ultimate end. Some nuclear dangers of the second emerging nuclear era are more potent than those of the first. Hence, the responsibility of states to pursue disarmament is broader perhaps than ever before. But the diminution of the prospect of a massive nuclear war has made the world appear to be safer for governments to embrace nuclear capabilities as currencies of power and prestige. And this, I think, is the case for the nuclear haves and the nuclear have-nots alike. Both types of governments, grasping the short-term fix that nuclear weapons seem to offer, have abandoned the long-term imperative of nuclear disarmament. For this reason, we need to find initiatives that transcend this debate between the haves and have-nots, transcend the debate, frankly, between whether U.S. nuclear policy or nuclear terrorism is a greater threat. Find a way in which those types of threats are on a common ground. And for this reason, I think civil society efforts to rekindle a global movement toward nuclear disarmament are as vital as ever. More than before, such efforts must now also recognize the depths to which nuclear weapons and nuclear threat making are enmeshed in global security relations, and must therefore offer progressive new forms of global governance that create security structures sustainable in a non-nuclear world. The imperative of disarmament today is inseparable from the need to establish global governance independent of the sovereign state system based on principles of law and democratic accountability. In my paper, I conclude with a quote from William Arthur Ward, but I'd like instead to come back to the metaphor that Jackie introduced earlier from the film Field of Dreams. Those of you who've seen this film, know that Kevin Costner, in his farm in Iowa, sees the ghost of Shoeless Joe Jackson, who tells him to build a baseball field in the middle of his cornfields. And at the deepest moment of his doubt, at the deepest moment in which he thought this idea just crazy and ridiculous, James Earl Jones comes along and powerfully and evocatively convinces him that if he builds it, they will come. And I would like to suggest that something akin to roadmaps to nuclear disarmament, that idea or something like it, is like that stadium in the cornfield. If we build it, they will come. Thank you.
Well, thank you for the kind introduction, and I also want to thank the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation for inviting me to participate in this important conference, especially among so many august people. As Ambassador Graham said, I recently moved from Washington, D.C. to Muscatine, Iowa, and hearing just the comments of wait a moment ago, I feel now compelled to build a baseball diamond. I find the topic of this forum, and this particular panel, quite challenging, international strategies for changing U.S. nuclear policy, because frankly, I find domestic strategies for changing U.S. nuclear policy so challenging, and to remove it one further then adds a level of difficulty that I'm not sure that I'm prepared for. But I'm going to try to look at one particular specific aspect and see where maybe there might be a glimmer of hope to make some progress on some things. And I want to start off with asking you to imagine a story. Imagine if you were to leave here and go check Yahoo News or CNN or what have you, and you heard this. Today we have learned that China has transferred over 450 nuclear weapons to North Korea. These tactical nuclear weapons are officially under the control of the Chinese military. However, when pressed, China admits that North Korean military aircraft have been modified to carry Chinese nuclear weapons. Not only that, North Korean soldiers are training alongside the Chinese, and North Koreans will control the weapons should the need to use them ever arise. China strenuously insists that this nuclear sharing is acceptable because the weapons are currently in Chinese hands. And should they ever be activated and transferred to the North Korean military, that still is justified because in a time of war, international rules do not apply. Can you imagine what the reaction in Washington and around the globe would be to such a situation? It's almost unimaginable, the degree of anxiety, rage, unacceptability that this would cause. Yet, this basic arrangement is exactly the same position that the United States holds right now and has for the last 50 years, except that rather than North Korea and China, the real situation involves U.S. nuclear weapons in Europe. Since the 1950s, the United States has deployed thousands of nuclear weapons under the aegis of NATO nuclear policy. Not only that, nuclear weapons have been deployed not in nuclear countries such as France, and not only in other nuclear countries in Europe such as the United Kingdom, but in non-nuclear states as well. While the U.S. weapons in Europe have gone down since the end of the Cold War, a very important report, which I would recommend to you heartily, from Hans Christensen of the Natural Resources Defense Council, has concluded that today the United States still maintains 480 nuclear weapons in Europe, based at 8 locations in 6 countries, not only the United Kingdom, but also the non-nuclear states of Belgium, Germany, Italy, Netherlands, and Turkey. 480 nuclear weapons in Europe by the United States is more than twice the number previously believed to still remain in Europe before the NRDC report. And as well, it's larger than the entire nuclear arsenals of any other country in the world with the exception of Russia. Still, even if this is the case, why should this be a cause for concern, since we're the good guys? First, since this is an international law symposium, let's look at the legal questions. The controlling international law is, of course, found in the NPT, which lays out rights and obligations for nuclear and non-nuclear countries. And Article 1, the first article, first requirement, lays out explicitly that each nuclear weapon state party undertakes not to transfer to any recipient whatsoever nuclear weapons or control over such weapons, either directly or indirectly. And then on the other side, Article 2 lays out similar restrictions for non-nuclear countries to complete the circle, saying each non-nuclear weapon state party undertakes not to receive the transfer whatsoever of nuclear weapons. Well, that seems pretty clear to me. But then how does the United States and NATO argue for the legality of nuclear sharing in NATO? They give 2 explanations. First of all, they say that the nuclear sharing arrangements preceded the NPT, and that key delegations, in their phrase, to the NPT were notified of this prior to joining the NPT. And so, it's acceptable. Of course, the problem is that even if key delegations were made aware of these prior arrangements, NATO nuclear sharing was a tightly guarded secret, and the vast majority of countries who signed on to the NPT and bound themselves by its obligations had no idea that nuclear sharing was taking place and didn't find out until much, much later. The second rationale, given as to why this is acceptable, is that the United States nuclear weapons based in Europe are in the sole possession and under constant and complete custody and control of the United States. U.S. nuclear weapons would not be transferred to any host country, and this is, quote, unless and until a decision were made to go to war, at which the NPT treaty would no longer be controlling. While this may technically be true, I would argue that it twists and subverts the spirit and fundamental purpose of the NPT almost beyond recognition. Finally, in considering NPT legal issues, there is, of course, the continuing concern over Article 6, the obligation to move towards disarmament. And even if NATO nuclear sharing has not been in breach of Articles 1 and 2, it is easily arguable that the lack of progress on reductions of these European weapons, and the last reductions occurred in 1994, constitutes a breach of Article 6. Outside of the legal issues, NATO nuclear sharing causes and exacerbates additional problems as well. The current policy is hampering non-strategic reductions with Russia and harming our overall relationship with them. Russia still has thousands, as opposed to hundreds, of non-strategic nuclear weapons, and no international agreement limits their numbers or provides for transparency or accounting of those weapons. Nuclear sharing also makes broader negotiations on other issues which the United States says are important, such as the situation with Iran and others, more difficult. While the U.S. is seen as hypocritical and hyper-aggressive, it makes finding common ground when other states act similarly very challenging. And forward-based nuclear weapons have little or no strategic value in the current environment. Even U.S. military officials have questioned the continued utility of NATO nuclear sharing. None other than NATO Supreme Commander, U.S. Military Marines General James Jones, has doubted the utility of NATO nuclear weapons. So what is to be done? To address the topic of this panel in regards to the issue, what are the international influences on U.S. foreign policy? Well, the continuing basis of U.S. nuclear weapons on European soil is dependent on the host countries allowing this to continue. Without explicit cooperation from our European friends, the placement of U.S. nuclear weapons in Europe and the policies that bind non-nuclear weapon states to participate in these nuclear policies would end. And this is where the pressure must come from. Many states have opposed nuclear sharing for decades and have forcefully argued for the removal of U.S. nuclear weapons from Europe in NPT review conferences and elsewhere. But while there has been marginal progress in adding bureaucratic diplomatic language to some formal documents, there's been little real progress on the underlying policies. Recently, however, European leaders and populations have stepped up the pace, and this has been mentioned before, but it's worth mentioning again here. Last March, for instance, the Belgian Senate unanimously adopted a resolution calling for the gradual withdrawal of the American tactical nuclear weapons from Europe as fulfillment of Article 6 of the NPT. In April of 2005, the German Liberal Party introduced a resolution to the Bundestag similarly calling for the removal of weapons. Also, in the same month, a Norwegian Parliament Foreign Affairs Committee member reiterated the desire to see U.S. nuclear weapons removed from European soil, and already this year, prominent German politicians have repeated the call, and a new resolution has been introduced in 2006. A 2005 poll shows that 3/4 of the German public wants nuclear weapons out of Germany. And as was mentioned this morning, in January 2006, the Norwegian Ministry of Finance excluded 7 companies from the country's government pension fund global, as it's called, selling approximately $500 million in shares to divest itself from companies that were involved in the productions of nuclear weapons. So there are activities that are being done, and I would encourage them to be only increased. But while the main goal is and should be the removal of U.S. nuclear weapons from Europe, there are some smaller steps that it would at least be an improvement over the current situation. And NATO could play an important role in strengthening international law by doing these following steps: ratification of the CTBT, efforts to negotiate a fissile material cutoff treaty, the establishment of an ad hoc committee on nuclear disarmament at the Conference on Disarmament, the adoption of a no first use policy, and negotiations on Russia on the verifiable elimination of substrategic nuclear weapons and on warhead accounting. Scaling back and eliminating NATO nuclear policies would be a significant change to U.S. nuclear policies. It would realign U.S. nuclear forces on a much less aggressive and confrontational footing and necessarily decrease the role of non-strategic nuclear weapons in U.S. nuclear planning. Further, continued efforts on the part of European leaders and those who support and influence them may actually provide a bright spot in an otherwise disturbing and worrisome trend along nuclear weapons policies. Thanks.
The World today is more characterized by disorder than by order. And so it's no accident that the situation is more described by complexity than simplicity. So the situation after the end of the Cold War is, to some degree, described by the paradigm of chaos theory that was so popular in the 1980s in science. And the situation after the Cold War is actually really, to a considerable degree, a chaotic situation. And the question is it possible in this new world situation to impose some kind of order? The question is, which kind of order? So the world is facing a number of risks and threats, and it's not just the terrorist threat we are facing, it's also violent conflict within society and between nations, and it's a variety of environmental problems, including climate change, and in economic problems, and all these problems are interrelated. The terrorist threat, for instance, is connected to some of these problems, and so we have to deal with these problems to avoid terrorism. Even though we all know about the benefits of cooperation, the question is, why is there not more cooperation between states? Why is there so much conflicts that are going on? And the reason is that the mindsets of many decision makers are still shaped by what is described as the prisoner's dilemma in game theory, which means that even though we know that if we all cooperate with each other, the individual benefits from non-cooperation could still lead to a situation in which we all do not cooperate and end up in a conflict. That's a problem that the mindset is still shaped by this situation. So the question is, how do you get rid of this mindset that leads to these prisoner's dilemma situations? The history of warfare is, to a considerable degree, described by security dilemmas that are caused by this prisoner's dilemma, which means the states trying to increase their security by avoiding threat from other states and build up threats themselves which threaten other states, which ends up in an arms race. And these arms races could lead to a war. So we need to get rid of these security dilemmas, and the question is basically how. An important way of doing it is to define rules and agreements, because these rules and agreements make us sure that we still stay in the state of cooperation, in which we avoid conflict. And this basically is the reason that international law is so important. International law describes in legal terms what the agreement is, so we can find out if someone changes from the state of agreement. So to do this, we need verification to make this sure that we still agree and cooperate with each other. And the second thing is enforcement, which is a kind of punishment in case someone violates an agreement. Could be also put in positive terms. It could be an incentive to stick to the agreement. To do this, we need to strengthen international law, to strengthen international security. That's basically the message of my talk, and I want to give several examples. The question is, why do we, in these days, do not have more international law? And the one reason is that we have a strong state, a hegemon state, which thinks still they can make sure their security alone, by acting alone. They don't need other states and no agreement with them, simply because they think they have enough power to compensate for any disadvantage and for any risks that comes up in this world. So we do need to convince the citizens of this country that cooperation is important for this country, because otherwise we end up in a situation where the security also for the United States is undermined. So this is also an important message, that we need to make sure that the citizens of this country understand that this can be only a temporary benefit not to cooperate. I've given 3 examples in my paper, and the paper is much longer than I can talk about and includes a lot of technical details about how and why we can design international law mechanisms to deal with some of the threats we are facing. And I'm focusing on 3 threats in particular. One is the nuclear threat and nuclear weapons. The second thing is the ballistic missile threat. And the third one is space weapons and space arms race and space security. The first one, nuclear disarmament, there has been a lot of discussion in the early 90s, and there was great hopes actually in the early 90s that we could have an elimination of nuclear weapons after the Cold War. These hopes unfortunately failed. There were many activities going on in the early 90s among non-governmental organizations and governmental organizations that were trying to build a regime and a momentum towards the elimination of nuclear weapons, and I took part in this like several others here, and these activities were focusing on the Non-Proliferation Treaty Conference in 1995. We came up with a proposal for elimination of nuclear weapons through a Nuclear Weapons Convention. At that time, this was presented in New York, and there was a great support for this, actually. Among non-governmental organizations, there was the Abolition 2000 network being formed, which is kind of self-organized network, and also among governments, many governments actually were supporting of the idea of elimination of nuclear weapons. The question was, at that time, how this could be done. And one mechanism that we tried to design was a process leading towards the elimination of nuclear weapons. And part of this process was the idea of drafting a model nuclear weapons convention. Several individuals and organizations took part in this drafting process, and it ended in 1997 with the first draft of a model nuclear weapons convention, which describes the process towards a nuclear weapons-free world, and also a legal document, how this could be basically put into legal terms to make sure that states cooperate. So this is an existing document that was also a United Nations document in 1997, and unfortunately since then not much has happened. The situation was politically declining after 1997. You all know about Indian-Pakistan nuclear testing and missile testing and the missile defense programs and the Rumsfeld Commission in the United States. So the situation was really declining. Then 9/11 came and also on in Bush administrations. The situation looks much worse today than it was 10 years ago. One of the reasons was that the chances were missed that we had at that time. And one of the reasons was that the idea of a model nuclear weapons convention was not really adopted by the major nuclear weapon states. We had support for this idea by 2/3 of the nations. There were United Nations resolutions from 1996 on, which was supported by a large majority of the states, including China as a nuclear weapon state. At that time, also India was supportive of it. Unfortunately, the NATO states were basically the only states really opposing this idea, led by the United States. I still want to revive this idea, and 10 years ago I drafted the roadmap. You're talking about roadmaps here. I wanted to show a roadmap. I brought a slide with me, but we have no opportunity to show it here, which described the roadmap, which is a combination of a stepwise approach with a comprehensive approach. We should not play these against each other, because if we want to move towards the targets, of course we need some steps, some immediate steps. And part of this roadmap were the immediate steps, such as, of course, fissile material cutoff and a comprehensive test ban, more nuclear weapon-free zones, confidence-building measures, transparency measures between states. These are all small steps which are very important, of course, to make sure that the process is going on. It's not only the end point, the target, which is important, it's the process which is important, that we all take part in. And this process is the process of coalition formation among states, in strengthening cooperation among states, but also among citizens. And this coalition formation process is very important. We had some important steps in 1997, such as the Middle Power Initiative and the New Agenda Coalition. We need to proceed on this, in this process further, but with a clear goal in mind, namely that we want to end up in a treaty that really bans and eliminates these weapons in a controlled, verified, enforced manner. And I don't want to go into the details of this nuclear weapons convention, this model, but it's important that it had, of course, designed in the first article the major legal statements that we want to get rid of the nuclear weapons, but also the whole process and the infrastructure. That's part of it, including the delivery systems, including command and control systems. It's not just that banning the weapons is enough, or the warheads. It's also a process that has to be described here. And the whole document is 60 pages long, so you see how complex such a treaty can be, and it builds also on existing treaties. So much about the Nuclear Weapons Convention and as one mechanism to achieve a nuclear weapon-free world. A second example I wanted to give is the control of delivery systems for weapons of mass destruction, in particular ballistic missiles. End of the 1990s, the discussion was strongly shaped by missile defense and the so-called threat of ballistic missiles. And this ignored basically the fact that the existing threat from ballistic missiles is basically the ballistic missiles of the nuclear weapon states. They're the only countries basically which have intercontinental range ballistic missiles. While the other states which don't have them yet are seen as the major threat. So there's also this discrimination that you can see in the nuclear field also extends to the ballistic missile field. And so one approach that we have chosen to respond to this so-called missile threat and the missile defense was our project that we had moving beyond missile defense. And this was a cooperative project between INESAP, the Science Network, and the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation. We had a couple of activities and workshops there to design alternatives to missile defense. And actually there are lots of alternatives. Missile defense is probably the worst solution to the missile problem that you can imagine. I think arms control and disarmament are much better transparency measures, cooperation among missile powers and emerging missile states, also cooperation in outer space is very important. While missile defense rather fuels the missile threat, because this leads to the offense-defense arms race. So we have also designed a lot of activities in this field that could be pursued. And again, there was a roadmap for dealing with the missile threat, immediate steps combined with the goal of the elimination of ballistic missiles, because ballistic missiles actually are really, you could even say they are not really useful for military purpose. They are only useful to impose a threat on the population. So for this reason, even in military terms, like nuclear weapons, you could argue that they are not really useful for security. They are not useful instruments for security. It's only political. They are only political instruments, I would say. So the third field I want to talk about is outer space, which is actually very closely related to ballistic missiles, because ballistic missiles opened outer space because they made it possible to enter into outer space. And the international community has, since the beginning of the space age, strongly urged for peaceful purposes of peaceful uses of outer space, for the banning of space weapons. We had some progress with the Outer Space Treaty and in the 60s, which, however, did not ban weapons in space. Generally, it restrained military activities in outer space, but did not ban the space weapons. It banned only weapons of mass destruction in the orbit. And this is not enough, because we are currently facing a situation in which at least one state pursues the option of weaponizing space to counter, as it is said, to counter threats and the possibility of a Pearl Harbor in space, as it is mentioned in the second Rumsfeld Commission report that came out in 2001. So the US government thinks there is a big threat for a Pearl Harbor in space, but I think this is an imaginary threat. No other country really at this point has any interest or the capability to threaten the United States. The capabilities are all on the United States side. So it's, again, it's a kind of an arms race within the United States. So the chances are still there, because we have no weapons in space. We have annual resolutions of the United Nations for preventing an arms race in outer space, and all countries support these resolutions except the US and I think Israel. So I think there are big opportunities in this field. There have been many proposals in this field, how such a space weapons ban could be designed, how security in outer space could be strengthened, and how we could avoid both the missile and missile defense threat, which extends into outer space, could be indeed prevented. And again, this requires international law, and this requires regime that is controlled and enforced by all states. If we do not take the current opportunity in this field and also the two other fields, then it is well possible that we end up in a situation that is described in these worst-case scenarios by the Rumsfeld Commission. Because they describe a threat situation which is not there, but by the action they take, they create the situation. That's the illogic of the whole thing, and we should not share this illogical situation. We should not accept the prisoner's dilemma. We should not act as prisoners which are caught in a security dilemma. We should act as free citizens who pursue peace. And to do this, actually, we need law. Like on the national level, we will also need law on the international level. And this needs to be verified and enforced. And this, I think, is a way of creating a more orderly world situation, not in a way that we have a central authority controlling everything, but that we have a self-organized process of cooperation building, coalition formation that learns from chaos theory and non-dynamics in the science and natural sciences. So thank you.
Hi. Well, my paper is The Inalienable Right to Nuclear Power, a Recipe for Chaos. And just as background, the Non-Proliferation Treaty that we're talking about offered a sweetener to all the countries that promised not to get nuclear weapons. In their Article 4, they gave them the inalienable right to peaceful nuclear technology.
Alice, the mic, lower the mic.
So, but peaceful nuclear technology is an oxymoron for the 21st century. The international community had clearly acknowledged its dual nature when it required the signature of 44 nuclear-capable nations in the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty before the treaty could enter into force. And with the U.S. policy now, with the drums of war beating as we watch the transformation of the imperial U.S. military into a global strike force seeking, quote, full-spectrum dominance, and its apparent willingness to wage illegal preemptive wars, their recent nuclear posture review authorizing the use of nuclear weapons even against non-nuclear weapon states, and it's actually naming the so-called rogue states as the axis of evil. I mean, this is why we're reaping the grim whirlwind of these policies. North Korea and Iran are now relying on Article 4 of the NPT to develop what they are describing as peaceful nuclear technology, which would certainly give them the capacity and materials they need to build bombs of their own as a deterrent against the threats that are coming from the U.S. We don't know whether they're going to build the bombs, but they certainly will be able to. I mean, that's what the CTB says. There are now 440 peaceful reactors in 31 countries, all producing deadly bomb materials, with 283 research reactors in 56 countries, some that produce highly enriched uranium, which is weapons grade. And the CIA director, George Tenet, the former CIA director, said, quote, "The difference between producing low-enriched uranium and weapons-capable high-enriched uranium is only a matter of time and intent, not technology." Because there's a lot of talk, well, we'll give people low-enriched uranium reactors and that'll be okay. It won't cause weapons proliferation. Right now, there are nearly 2 million kilograms of reactor waste in the world, with only 5 kilograms needed to make one nuclear bomb. And we've been very abstract, talking about the war, but you can't imagine what this is doing to our health and environment. I mean, countless studies report higher incidence of birth defects, cancer, genetic mutations in every situation where nuclear technology is employed, whether for war or for peace. And our National Research Council, just in 2005, reported that exposures to X-rays and gamma rays, even at low dose levels, can cause cancer. And they define low dose as a range from near zero up to about 10 times that from a CAT scan. And one of their panelists, a distinguished professor of radiology at Stanford and Harvard, said, quote, "There appears to be no threshold below which exposure can be viewed as harmless." Tens of thousands of tons of nuclear waste accumulate at civilian reactors with no solution for its storage, releasing toxic doses of radioactive waste into our air, water, and soil, and contaminating our planet and its inhabitants for an unimaginable 250,000 years that it remains harmful to us. I mean, all of recorded history is 5,000 years. And now you have the International Atomic Energy Agency, dominated by industry, and they've been covering up these disastrous health effects. Even with the Chernobyl tragedy, they understated the deaths by attributing only 50 deaths directly to Chernobyl. And we have studies from Russia and Ukraine which estimated thousands of deaths and tens of thousands who suffered thyroid cancer and leukemia as a result of the accident, with more to come. And there is a collusive agreement between the International Atomic Energy Agency and the World Health Organization, which provides in its terms that if either organization initiates any program activity in which the other has or may have a substantial interest, the first party shall consult with the other with a view to adjusting the matter by mutual agreement. This means that our scientists and researchers at the WHO are required to have their work vetted by the nuclear industry's champion for peaceful nuclear technology, the IAEA. And I want to give you an example in the area of food irradiation. WHO abandoned its original 1961 research agenda on the human health implications, and it ceded it to the IAEA, which is now leading a global campaign to further the legalization, commercialization, and consumer acceptance of irradiated foods. And here's what one of their reports says. "We must confer with experts in the various fields of advertising and psychology to put the public at ease," and recommending that the process should not be put on the label. And yet we see this NRC study saying there's no safe dose of radiation, and so clearly the public's rational fear of radiation is justified. It's time for the International Atomic Energy Agency to give up its dual mission in nuclear technology. While the agency plays an indispensable role in inspecting and verifying compliance with nuclear disarmament agreements, it should not continue to act with a manifest conflict of interest as a shill for the nuclear industry. And whatever naivete may have existed back in 1953 about the potential of harnessing nuclear technology for benign purposes when President Eisenhower made his Atoms for Peace speech at the UN, we can no longer turn a blind eye. I mean, Eisenhower said, "The United States knows that if the fearful trend of atomic military buildup can be reversed, this greatest of destructive forces can be developed into a great boon for the benefit of mankind. The U.S. knows that peaceful power from atomic energy is no dream of the future. That capability already proved is here now today. Who can doubt if the entire body of the world's scientists and engineers had adequate amounts of fissionable material with which to test and develop their ideas, that this capability would rapidly be transformed into universal, efficient, and economic usage?" And it's interesting that in Eisenhower's famous farewell address, in which he warned the country of the military-industrial complex, he also cautioned about the abuse of science. He said, "In holding scientific research and discovery in respect as we should, we must also be alert to the equal and opposite danger that public policy could itself become the captive of a scientific technological elite." Can we doubt that the scientific technological elite at Los Alamos and Livermore laboratories have been driving the nuclear arms race, squandering lost opportunities for nuclear disarmament since the end of the Cold War, and developing new, untested weapons designs that create the need for more tests, which are used as an excuse to block the U.S. ratification of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. One delegate at this disastrous NPT review last spring shared quite frankly at an NGO panel that his country was unwilling to forego its unalienable right under the treaty because their scientists wouldn't want to be left behind in the state-of-the-art knowledge. They need to play in the big leagues of science with the big boys. So despite the promise of clean, safe, abundant energy from the sun, the wind, and the tides, many non-nuclear weapon states have understood their equal rights, their equal rights to the dark fruits of nuclear technology. Will this kind of scientific machismo continue to be supported when the very survival of our biosphere is at stake? Will we satisfy our scientists' dangerous thirst for knowledge and status, despite the obvious possibility that the peaceful nuclear reactor can readily be converted to a bomb factory? IAEA Director Mohammed Baradei recently stated, "We just cannot continue business as usual, that every country can build its own factories for separating plutonium or enriching uranium. Then we are really talking about 30, 40 countries sitting on the fence with a nuclear weapons capability that can be converted into a nuclear weapon in a matter of months." So now we're seeing with Iran this current flurry of negotiations and a move to try to control the production of the civilian nuclear fuel cycle in one central place. This simply won't fly. It would be just another discriminatory aspect of the NPT, creating yet another class of haves and have-nots under the treaty, as was done with those who are permitted to have weapons and those who are not. Now we're saying some can have their own nuclear fuel, while others, such as Iran and North Korea, would be precluded from doing so. And in the wake of the stern warnings to Iran and the referral of the issue to the Security Council, which has provoked Iran to begin reprocessing of nuclear fuel under its inalienable right, the U.S. has incomprehensibly now announced its global nuclear energy partnership to control the spread of nuclear materials. Here's their plan. Supplier nations would manufacture nuclear fuel rods, ship it to other countries all over the world by rail, road, and sea to use in their reactors, then ship it back, the irradiated fuel, and reprocess it, breaking a 30-year taboo in the U.S. on turning irradiated reactor fuel into weapons-grade material. Brazil, too, recently announced its intention to get into the action by proclaiming that it is weeks away from firing up a major uranium plant. We think we can control the atom, when in reality we have been pushing our luck since 1945 when we unleashed its awful power and created jerry-built structures to contain its terrifying consequences. We deliberately turn a blind eye to nuclear chaos for geopolitical reasons or commercial greed. Trying to exercise control over the reprocessing and distribution of nuclear fuels would be like going down the same path we've been on for the last 50-some-odd years for arms control. Do you think France, Japan, or the U.S., for example, will surrender control of nuclear materials production any more than the nuclear powers have surrendered control of atomic bombs? It would be a long, drawn-out effort with discriminatory rules in the end, when instead we could be expending our energy and intellectual treasure on shifting the energy paradigm to make nuclear and fossil fuel obsolete. But there are commercial interests which don't want to lose their ability to continue to profit from the human misery caused by nuclear and fossil fuels. The sun, the wind, the tides, geothermal energy are here in abundance for all the world's people, and they are free. We already have the technology to harness the bounty of the earth, and we know how to store it when the sun doesn't shine and the wind doesn't blow by using hydrogen fuel cells. It's clearly not beyond our financial means, particularly when you compare the costs of clean, safe energy to the more than $200 billion a year to subsidize fossil and nuclear fuels, while renewable energies receive less than a tenth of that amount worldwide. Not to mention the cost of war to protect those poisonous energy sources, or even the military infrastructure and naval operations operating during peacetime on guard duty for the oil tankers plying the seas with their noxious cargo. So why don't we have a 10-year crash program to achieve a nuclear fossil-free and biomass-free energy transition? Because of corporate interests that insist on peddling their polluting and proliferating sources of energy, their cash cows. Once the infrastructure is in for the sun and the wind, there will be nothing to sell. It would probably be one of the best ways to end poverty on the planet as well, since poor countries can get free, clean earth energy abundantly available and will not have to spend their meager budgets for their critical power needs. We need new thinking, and it has to start with us, people with no corporate axe to grind. We mustn't buy into the propaganda that clean, safe energy is decades away or too costly. There are mountains of evidence that those statements are false, deliberately disseminated by corporate spin machines to keep their profits coming. And don't be fooled by industry deceptions about how clean nuclear power is carbon-free. Fossil fuel is used in every step of the process of creating these standing bomb factories, from the mining, milling, and reprocessing of uranium to the decommissioning of aging plants and the transporting and storing of nuclear waste. If, as we work to phase in safe, clean energy, eliminating the evil twin of nuclear weapons, so-called peaceful nuclear technology, as we continue to press ahead for nuclear weapons abolition, we'll have a real roadmap to a nuclear-free world. Otherwise, I think we won't be dealing with a full deck and are doomed to failure, both in halting weapons proliferation and in saving our planet from the ravages of climate change caused by the massive carbon releases into our atmosphere. It's time to support a protocol to the NPT calling for the establishment of an international sustainable energy fund and begin to shift the massive subsidies and tax breaks for the development of abundant, safe energy of our Earth. Who ever heard of a terrorist attacking a windmill? Article 4 would become obsolete, just as Article 5, which provides for peaceful nuclear explosions, has been rendered inoperative by the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, which forbids nuclear explosions of any kind. Clean, safe energy is available to us now. We have the technology. It's an idea whose time has come. We need to be vigilant in providing the ample evidence in its favor to counter the commercial forces arguing that it's not ready, it's years away, it's too expensive, arguments made by companies in the business of producing dirty fuel. Here's what Franklin Delano Roosevelt had to say about similar forces in 1936. Quote, "We had to struggle with the old enemies of peace, business and financial monopoly, speculation, reckless banking, class antagonism, sectionalism, war profiteering. They had begun to consider the government of the United States as a mere appendage to their own affairs. We know now that government by organized money is just as dangerous as government by organized mob." What are the prospects for establishing an international sustainable energy agency? Last spring, you heard from Jackie, we had 40,000 people in Central Park marching for the abolition of nuclear weapons. You're going to hear later from Pamela about the Mayors for Peace campaign, how we're organizing to get the negotiation for the elimination of nuclear weapons completed in 2010 with the cold dismantling by 2020. They have a roadmap, too. And you heard about our model nuclear weapons treaty from Jurgen. This is our statute for an international sustainable energy fund that has now been circulating at the UN. I encourage you to take something. And they're coming into the Commission for Sustainable Development is meeting this spring at the UN, and they're going to be addressing energy for 2 years. And we're working with Abolition 2000 is working with the Energy Caucus there, and they've all adopted this, and we're trying to get a friendly government. You heard great examples from Matt, but my Matt, right. But here's a few others. The government of Sweden has announced its intention to rely completely on sustainable energy in the next 15 years as it phases out its existing nuclear power plants. And Germany, in their platform, although it hasn't actually moved up, has called for like-minded countries to amend the NPT to recognize the right to clean, safe energy as a human right and establish an international renewable agency, which would be added as a protocol to the NPT. You have the Global Alliance for the Prevention of Nuclear Weapons and Power in Space, working with grassroots groups all over the world to keep space of peace and support the Chinese and Russian initiatives to keep weapons out of space, which Jürgen told us the U.S. has blocked. And we heard about the great Norwegian divestment campaign, and Abolition 2000 is establishing a working group to follow up on that. And the Nato effort, Abolition Europe, the grassroots there have been supporting all these government efforts to get the nuclear weapons out of Europe. So, and this is really great. Next year, a massive demonstration is being organized by the women in the UK at Faslane in Scotland to protest the rebuilding of the Trident submarine arsenal in England. These are the women. They're following the example of the women in Greenham Commons who did a 19-year protest and encampment that resulted in the removal of NATO's nuclear-tipped cruise missiles from the UK. So we think this will be a great action next year, and that'll have some effect on UK policy. This past fall, led by Canada and Mexico, a group of middle power nations nearly succeeded in establishing special committees in the Committee for Disarmament in Geneva to begin discussions on nuclear disarmament and a space treaty. Under enormous pressure from the U.S., they withdrew their proposal, but promised to follow through next fall if there's no progress. The Middle Powers Initiative is supporting this process and other potential avenues to break the disarmament deadlock with its newly formed Article 6 Forum. So there's a lot of great action happening that you can join with. But we have to look at it holistically. We can't just look at nuclear disarmament without looking at changing over to sustainable energy. If we don't reject the American drive to empire and the idea that they're going to weaponize space and dominate the earth, we won't be able to get nuclear weapons. And if we try to control the fuel cycle by establishing another discriminatory nuclear apartheid system, we won't get agreement on that. I mean, there'll be countries that won't agree, so we're wasting our time. We should be moving towards the sustainable energy future. It's here, it's possible, and I think that's the best way to go for a lasting and peaceful nuclear-free world. Thank you.
I am very delighted to be with you all and to listen to both the speakers this morning and the speakers on the panel today. For me, it's all very much a learning process. And I want to thank the organisers for giving me that opportunity to be able to come here and to listen and to learn. And I would like to say that when I was listening to Alice's speech, I was remembering the fact that 2 years ago, our eldest son, Mark, and his wife, Rushing, invited two little Russian children from where they dropped Chernobyl, right. They lived in the area of Chernobyl, and Ireland has a programme, both north and south, where it brings the kids from Chernobyl to have a holiday in Ireland for health purposes. So these two little girls were invited so they could get some Irish sea and air. I promise you they didn't go swimming because the Irish Sea is too cold, but they most certainly got some air. And they were both two little girls, 10 years of age, and they complained during their holiday that they had pains in their gums. And when my daughter-in-law took them to the dentist said that their gums and their teeth were all being destroyed because of the effects of being in the area where the accident had took place. And their health was very, very poor. They didn't know really how much life these children had. And, it's all very well for us to talk about nuclearism, nuclear weapons, but when we know that these things are so highly dangerous, we really have to begin to think out of the box and what we can do about it. And I very much believe that Einstein got it very right when he said that we're technological giants and we're moral pygmies. Because we sort of lost our ability to really think with any kind of clarity that what's the right thing to do. I've always been inspired by Thomas Merton. And Thomas Merton talks a great deal in his writings about the need to have a clear conscience. And he said that we can have dulled conscience. And you know, we can read all the writers in the world and all the great theologians from any century, but you know, why do we need to go to often dusty books and old ideas when we have our own conscience? And how do we inform our conscience? I think that we take time to just contemplate, time to meditate, and time to listen to what is right and what we should do and should not do. So we have each of us and a conscience. We don't need the great intellects and philosophers and theologians, many of whom got it very wrong, including Augustine, because there was no such thing as a just war, because a just war qualifications can never, have never been met, and once more, most of the militarists don't read them anyway. You know, when the bomb was dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, I met Father George Sabelka. And Father George Sabelka, an American priest, a military chaplain, was the Catholic priest who blessed the crew that flew the plane Enola Gay over Hiroshima and dropped the bomb. He blessed them before they went on Tinian Island. And when they came back, Father George told me that he said, "Congratulations, a job well done, boys." And Father Sabelka, some years later, went to Hiroshima. And he walked in the ruins, and he met those who were suffering as a result of that. And he said he wept because he realized what they had done to the people of Hiroshima. And so he spent the rest of his life going round the world, especially back to Japan, saying, "I'm sorry, forgive me for what we've done." And Father George came from the great military mindset that this is the way to go, to when he died, a few weeks before he actually died, he sent me a beautiful letter. And in the letter he told me how in his living room he'd seen a butterfly that was dying because it was getting cold. And he lifted the butterfly and he brought it to his little warm airing cabinet and he put it into the heat in the hope that the butterfly would have life just for a little bit longer. Can you imagine the journey that man travelled from killing, and how many can you kill, to a butterfly, and how can you save it? And in a sense, what Father Sabelka's journey was all about is the journey that each one of us take. Because, you know, they might well blow up the world. They might well destroy it. I don't believe it will. But all that's asked of every single one of us is to live our lives out of the responsibility that we are given and the truth that every life is sacred, including our own, and we've no right to kill it. And in a sense, unless the human family moves in that direction, we will blow up the world. There's no doubt about it. So I think what we really have got to begin to do is take personal responsibility for what we do. You see, it's very easy to scapegoat, and that's something we all do. And we could scapegoat the president and say it was all his fault. We can scapegoat Iraq, Iran, North Korea. People are very good at scapegoating. Governments are excellent at scapegoating, because if you've got problems at home in America, where people don't have education and health care, and you've real problems, point the finger at somebody else and say it's their problem. Whip up the fear enough amongst your own people. Tell enough lies long enough and it almost becomes the truth. And that is what's happening in so many countries, particularly here in America today. So we must learn when scapegoating's taking place. We must demand of those who know the truth to tell the truth of what is happening. And Iran will be attacked by the United States of America or by Israel, because we can see the same cycle going on that went on with regard to Iraq. Iraq had no weapons of mass destruction. Gun done its job very well. Osama bin Laden was not in Iraq. All the lies that we were fed so that the United States of America could go into Iraq, control its resources, build its bases, and decide which is the next country it wants to go into. The agenda here is full spectrum dominance. You know, we know what happened with the Romans, and we're seeing it happening in the world today. And if we don't waken up and speak the truth and challenge this madness of militarism, this mad thinking that somehow we can go out and kill and control and have it all our way, we will not survive as a human family. So let's spell out the alternative. We would like the President of America to declare at the United Nations, nuclear weapons are bad for all our health. Nuclear weapons are a health issue. We're going to get rid of them. He could do it, and the world could do it, because we have got to move away from the idea that somehow nuclear weapons protect us. They don't protect us. Also, uphold international laws and human rights. You know, the greatest gift that has been given to us has been in the last 60 years, we have built up a body of international law and human rights. And if we begin to build on that base and strengthen it and insist people keep these laws, be they America, Israel, Iran, North Korea, Iraq, these are international laws, the UN Declaration of Human Rights, the Geneva Convention. These are our international laws, and if anybody breaks them, we hold them accountable before the International Court of Justice, including the United States of America. Because the United States of America is not leader of the world. They haven't got the moral capacity to be leader of the world, I'm very sorry to say. But what they are is equal member of the nations of the peoples of the world. So uphold our international laws. But you know, in the final analysis, and may I have a drink of water, please? I try help when I say just a drop. Okay. Here's to you. Here's to no nuclear bombs. In the final analysis, I think we've got to have a wider vision than just no nuclear bombs, and I'm so excited by what's happening in the world, because people recognise that we have to build alternative structures, alternative institutions, because we need security. People want security and we need it. So let's have a vision of something completely different. I mean, what about a non-violent, non-killing world? What about building non-violent, non-killing societies? You know, people are not mad and killing. Oh, less than 5% of people in the world have ever killed anybody. And to actually kill somebody, it's a pretty hard thing. So, I mean, we are non-violent by nature, and I passionately believe that. It hurts when we have to hurt somebody else. So let's have a dream of building non-violent, non-killing societies, and it's happening. Because what we're doing, we mightn't all be in the nuclear abolishment movement, but what we all are in is in our homes, in our families, in our communities, trying to live as decent human beings, trying to live out of love and compassion and forgiveness and putting out the hand of friendship. And everybody wants to live like that. You know, our young men and women don't want to have to go off and fight in Iraq and come back in body bags. They don't want to go off to Iran and come back in body bags. Neither do the Iraqi people, 100,000 of them, want to die. You know, so this craziness has somehow got to be challenged, and we can do it by building alternative, non-violent communities, and by, in every one of our governments, having non-violent and peace ministries. Why don't we put enough money into and looking at how we build diplomacy, how we deal with conflict resolution and ethnic conflicts, failed states? Why isn't the Pentagon discussing how you build diplomacy instead of how you weaponize the stars? You know, so, I mean, alternative thinking here. I mean, we should be equipped to deal with Katrina. And we're not. Disgrace to the world, disgrace to the world. We watched bodies lie in New Orleans for a week and not be picked up. The world watched that, and the world said, America has lost its soul. It's lost its soul. It's building weapons to kill people, predator zones, operated from a computer desk in the Pentagon. One flies over Pakistan, they drop it on 18 civilians and kill them. That is sick. That is absolutely, totally immoral and disgraceful, and it's not acceptable in the civilized world today. So we have got to challenge this madness. But who starts it? Where does it start? It's interesting where you find yourself in the journey of life. I mean, I found myself standing in Hiroshima, 6 million Jewish people burnt alive. I found myself standing in Dimona in Israel last year, where you have a nuclear plant. Imagine the Israeli people building nuclear weapons when they suffered like they suffered. Imagine them starting the arms race in the Middle East. I mean, it's unbelievable. Do you know where I found myself standing yesterday, of all the places? I had an interview out at the University of California, where the most prestigious university, where your best brains and intelligence are planning nuclear weapons, actually planning them. You know, these men who go home and women to their children and love them deeply, sitting in their science labs, producing the latest weapons that are going to, if used, destroy the earth. Wasn't it somebody actually produced the gas chambers that were used in Auschwitz concentration camp? It was people in white collars and blue collars with brilliant intellects that built gas chambers that were used in Auschwitz concentration camp. And it's people here, your intellectuals, who are building the bombs that, if dropped, will kill millions. Well, do you know what I call that? I call that disgraceful. I would like to say to those men and women, who do you think you are, God? Do you think you're God? That you can decide what kind of weapons to build that's going to burn kids alive wherever they're dropped? Do you take responsibility or do you not? Or like Pilate, are you going to wash your hands of the blood of the kids, women and children that your inventions are dropped on? So you see, the chain starts in the laboratory with the scientists and the brilliant men who are looking at gold medal for developing the latest bomb. And it goes up to the next person who produces it. And it goes up to the next person who pays for it in their tax money, because we pay for it in our tax money. And it goes up to the next person who delivers it. And it goes to the pilot who has to fly over the city and drop it. And if we don't personally take responsibility and break that chain, like Mordecai Vanunu did, then we are part of the problem and not the solution. So we have a long way to go to build a kind of world where every human life is sacred, where life is celebrated, where it really doesn't matter if it's the North Korean kids, and I hope to visit North Korea in the next couple of months. I'm looking forward to going there. And I think let's not allow our governments to demonize our brothers and sisters. If they're in China or North Korea or Iran, let's not allow them to demonize them and then send innocent kids out to kill them or drop bombs on them. We're better than that. We can change our world. All is lacking. It's not hard to do it. You've heard hard to do it, and the speakers here. All is lacking is the real will to do it and the belief that we each can take responsibility to beautify our world through our gifts and talents, be that singing or dancing. Do I make a beautiful world by what I do? Or do I use my beautiful gifts in creating things that will destroy life and destroy creation? The choice is up to each of us, and all we can do is try to make a good choice.